Greetings, YouTube. Today we're taking a look at The Knife Man by Wendy Moore, Blood, Body Snatching, and the Birth of Modern Surgery. This is a biography of John Hunter, a man who took the amazing concept that maybe we should apply the scientific method to surgery. This being the 18th century, that wasn't necessarily a very popular position to take. This was an era where they still believed, for the most part, that there were four humors in the body that you had to keep in balance, otherwise you wouldn't remain healthy, and the most common surgical treatment for any kind of an illness was bloodletting. Yes, it was not what you would consider an enlightened time. It wasn't completely enlightened, of course. It wouldn't be until the 19th century that somebody started to figure out that, maybe we should wash our hands and change our clothes and clean our tools, because in John Hunter's period, they wore the same clothing every day when they went to surgery. They never wore masks. They never washed their hands, nor did they ever wash their tools. And it's kind of surprising that anyone that ever had surgery in that era survived it all. They must have had immune systems like nobody's business. But this is also an era before anesthesiology of any significant kind. They had some kind of opioids, but they were very primitive. Sometimes they'd only get somebody mildly drunk before they did surgery, and sometimes it was just two big burly dudes who held somebody down while they did surgery on you while you were wide awake and with nothing to alleviate the pain at all. And they were doing some pretty advanced bits of surgery. Seeing is that, again, the science wasn't all that scientific, and again, it was horribly, I can't imagine having to have, for example, kidney stones removed from one's bladder while you're awake. That would be horrible. Yeah. He threw out the concepts of humors. He was a pragmatic Scotsman that wanted to look at the world as he saw it. He didn't believe in book learning, as it were. He wasn't a big reader. His writing was atrocious, and for the most part, he dictated what he wanted written down to assistants and things like that, who were much better at writing than he was. And I've seen some of the spellings he used. He was not consistent, and nor was he talented at it. But he observed the world. He looked at things, and he wanted to have questions answered that nobody else was asking. No one was poking at things to see how they worked. They were just taking, for the most part, some things that had come down to them from the Greeks and the Romans in the classical era, and still applying those to what they considered to be the modern world of the 18th century. Remember, he began his career prior to the American Revolution, and he went till the end of the 18th century. I believe he died in 1792, if I'm not incorrect. So amazing that science hadn't been applied to that particular field, because it had been applied to so many other things. I mean, this is an era when they were coming up with steam engines. Okay, the principles of steam engines were being practiced at the end of the 18th century, and yet they still hadn't really applied the scientific method to medicine. In the beginning of his career, surgeons and barbers were in the same guild. They weren't split off till later. And for the most part, surgeons were looked down upon by doctors, who were not the people that did cutting so much. They did more of the chemical treatments, most often which were nothing more than poisoning people with mercury. Now, even though he did use the scientific method, and he helped write one of the foundational documents for the practice of dentistry, and helped write a foundational document for the foundation of veterinarian medicine, and was key in putting together one of the most scientifically rigorous collections of fossils and studies of abnormal life when it came to animals and humans, aberrations and mutations and things like that. And he really did lay down some pieces of information that were prescient. They were in the same vein as Darwin would do, 100 years later, or less than 100 years later. But he was a contemporary to Ben Franklin. That's really cool. Um, but it wasn't all puppies and sunshine. You see, he was probably the most famous anatomist, or what we would call a forensic surgeon. He did autopsies, and he did more of them probably in anyone in the entire world in the 18th century. He did thousands of autopsies. He was incredibly good at them. Not only was he talented at the concepts of opening up a body, but he would pick apart little itty bitty bits of the human body and create these uh, display pieces where he would like inject colored wax into veins and arteries and things, and then so he could present them to students. His brother ran a educational facility. It was again private school, kind of private education, and he did most of the preparations that were presented, and which of course his brother stole credit for. There was quite a bit of acrimony between he and his brother. Um, the problem is that in the 18th century, in fact, all the way up till 1832, it was illegal in Britain to get corpses. The surgeons, the Barbers and Surgeons Guild was only allowed 2 corpses a year for the purposes of dissection. And his brother promised his students that every single student would have access to their own corpse. That meant he needed a lot of corpses. And John Hunter helped to establish a commodified, very rigorous industrial philosophy around body snatching. Yep, he helped establish a very prolific class of people whose job was to go steal bodies. And they were not killing people. That would actually did happen in at a later time in history, but they were just, as soon as somebody was in the ground, they were digging them up the same day. And in fact, they were so good at it that there were cases where a team of body snatchers would go to steal a body and the body was already gone, but the previous team had been so good at putting things back the way it was supposed to look that the professional body snatchers that came after them didn't notice until they got to the coffin. These guys were professionals, and John Hunter did not only help fund that and fuel it in the sense that he needed the body, so he was dealing with these people on a regular basis, but he himself was involved in them. He was himself a body snatcher. It's how he helped his brother's business supplied with bodies, and not to mention himself. Um, and this is a time when you only could really do that kind of thing in the winter. You couldn't do it in the summer because the bodies rotted too fast. But it had gotten so rampant at one point where a family discovered that their relative's body had been stolen. So the community they were outraged. So each family went to their graves of their family members and wanted to see if their corpses were still there, only to find out that every single grave was empty. The body snatchers had stolen them all as soon as they'd been in the ground. That's just astounding. Of course, they also got them from other places, like they would get them from prisons and things like that. So there were other ways of getting them, but most often it was stealing them right out of the ground. He did also a lot of research into like crossbreeding and trying to figure out what the source of life was, trying to figure out, could you breed these animals together? Could you transplant body parts and things from one animal to another, which didn't often work. He also, unfortunately, was championing the concept of live tooth transplantation. So he would take a tooth out of a perfectly healthy tooth out of someone's body, someone's jaw, and then implant it into the jaw of someone who'd lost a tooth, which I guess worked temporarily. Like I guess some of them lasted as long as like 6 years before they would fail. But that meant he was paying people who had perfectly good teeth and ripping them out of their skulls so that he could then put them into the jaws of wealthy people. Morally dubious. He conducted experiments on people without their permission. The concept of getting permission for that kind of thing didn't even occur to folks back then. He was not the only person doing that. But he also did things that we would find difficult to tolerate and were difficult to read, because he conducted experiments on live animals. including vivisection. Those sections of the book were very hard for me to read. These just helpless animals being literally cut into pieces while they were alive for the purposes of furthering scientific experimentation. I understand it was the 18th century. It was still horrific. And nobody really thought anything of it. That was just, I mean, this is an era, this is a time when it wasn't too far from the time when they were boiling cats for entertainment. That was something that actually went on at certain in Europe at certain times in the past. So yes, it was a horrific practice. And did it maybe help save lives? I'm not sure if it did. I'm not sure if they couldn't have discovered this information in another way. John Hunter seemed to learn something from it, but that doesn't necessarily mean there weren't other ways of getting that information that he just didn't know about because things weren't as scientific at the time. He was literally laying down these foundations. He eventually became famous the world over for both being a skilled surgeon, the foremost anatomist there was in the world, a person that was putting together the vast collection of his, and eventually opening his own museum. He had a wide selection of wild animals that he experimented with, and he kept as pets. He was constantly collecting the bodies of the dead animals. He'd like from menageries and zoos and circuses. He would pay for their bodies so he could then take them apart and look at them. He had a stuffed giraffe in an era when some people weren't even sure if giraffes were a real thing and they weren't just a fanciful myth. But he also had somebody follow a giant, a human who had giantism, who I believe he was 7'8", though he was reported to be 8'4". And he had somebody shadow this dude and keep tabs on him. So as soon as he died, he could get this guy's corpse. A man who went out of his way to try to do everything he could to make sure his corpse did not fall into the hands of an anatomist, because he was terrified by this concept. He was a good Irish Catholic boy and did not want his body to be chopped into little pieces. And yet John Hunter bribed somebody. He bribed the undertaker to get the body, and they filled the coffin full of rocks, and that's what got dropped in the sea, because that's what the guy had wanted to have done with his body, so that it would not fall into the hands of someone who was going to dissect it. And not only did he violate this guy's wishes, hound him, harass him, trying to wait for him to die, but eventually displayed his body to the public without any permission from his family. So John Hunter was not what we would consider the champion of ethical or moral behavior, but he was a guy that helped establish scientific surgery. So he needs to be lauded for that, and we just need to never forget that he did things that were very problematic. So this is an incredibly well-written book. It's a lot of fun to read. Even the chapters that deal with animals, I had a hard time reading some. There were literal paragraphs I had to skip. But it was still information that was interesting and vital to his research, and I think to his life story as well. So, incredibly good book. And with a title like The Knife Man, it was something I had to own. Because I'm definitely into knives. Go check my gear stuff. So I highly recommend this. Wendy Moore did an excellent job with this book. I'm going to look up and see what else she's written, because this was just a lot of fun to read, very informative, and it was just it was great to see how many famous lives he intersected with. It was just fascinating. So if you are a fan of history, and particularly of science and medical history, this is something you are definitely going to want to read.